Welcome to Inner Peace with Dr. Reese, a program that can help you become liberated in the modern world. Now, here's your host, Dr. Kevin W. Reese.
So, are you ready to die? It's a very serious question. Are you? Are you ready to go? Today? Tomorrow? Next month? 20 years from now? You don't know when it's going to happen, but you do know that it is going to happen. Welcome to episode number 47. Today, I want to talk about the taboo subject of death. I've been sprinkling it throughout this whole podcast because it's the most important topic of all. So I'm excited to talk to Dr. Nichol Burris, who is a professional end-of-life counselor. She's an author, she's a grief counselor, and she's helped many people transition through their death, as well as the family around them. There's so much to talk about because it's such a heavy topic with, micro topics that fall underneath the big topic. And it's just this big tree with lots of branches. So I'm glad to have an expert on to talk death 101. Dr. Burris, hello.
Hi, Dr. Reese. How are you?
Oh, I can't complain. Welcome to the Peace Pod. We are alive, and so we're able to talk about this. How amazing is this whole death thing, huh?
So death is amazing because most of us limit our death experience to our religious experience. And believe it or not, it has nothing to do with religion, but it's really about spirituality.
Yeah.
So whether someone is a Buddhist or they're Christian or they're Catholic or they're atheist or agnostic or whatever it is, there are just some end-of-life phenoms that happen that I can't explain to make sense because they don't make sense, right? But neither does dying. But we all have to die at some point in time.
Yeah, I'm glad you just spoke on that, sort of the esoteric spiritual side. But before we get into all that, can you shed some light on sort of the basics?
When we're talking about end of life, we're thinking really about the other person, the person that's dying, which, yes, we need to think about, but we also have to begin thinking about the people that are experiencing the watching of the death, which sometimes can be very difficult, especially if they're not educated in what they're seeing or why they're seeing it, whether or not they're in denial of what's happening or accepting of what's happening. So all of that really makes a difference in the person that's dying.
Right.
So, oftentimes as we're going through, our loved ones will stop eating, they'll stop drinking, right? And that's really the hard part, one of the hardest things to have to endure, because we're an eating society. We associate eating with health, right?
Yeah, and comfort.
Absolutely. And so what happens is when we try to force, for lack of better words, our loved one to eat or drink, what people don't realize is it really causes more discomfort for that person. Because as we're dying, the body really doesn't need, nor does it want all the nourishment, right? It doesn't want water. It doesn't want the eggs and the bacon, those kinds of things. So it's important to understand that when we overly encourage someone to eat, or we make them feel like they have to eat, because the body can't digest it the way it ought to, it sits and it causes more discomfort for a loved one. And then it goes into places that it shouldn't go, and you start swelling and those kinds of things. So eating and not drinking is okay. It's really the body's way of going back to its natural state. Right? One of the other things that, when someone is dying, one of what families struggle with is do I become a do not resuscitate, or am I a full code? And unfortunately, I think that that's also where, we see Hollywood, right? And we see, oh my gosh, if we don't do CPR, then I'm killing you, right? But that's not the case. And so what happens is, for someone, especially if they have a terminal illness, cancer, cardiac arrest, chronic heart failure, those kinds of things, doing CPR is very difficult and traumatic,
Mm.
because you can actually stand to crush some ribs, right? Because it's a very harsh technique. It's not, I know we see the 1, 2, 3 blow, and it seems so easy, but it's not. In order, because the heart is covered by the rib cage. And really, in order for it to get a jump start, you've got to push pretty hard. And for someone who is already terminal, the trauma of that and the likelihood of someone coming back with CPR is slim to none. But
Mm.
even if they do, they don't come back talking. And so now you have a whole nother can of worms. So those are some of the things that we see, and it is traumatic. And we have had people, very few, that have decided to do that. But when you have a person who is terminal, or their wish is just to die peacefully, then that's really what do not resuscitate means. It's just so that they can have a peaceable death.
Yeah, this is information that a lot of people aren't thinking about.
Right. And people, and they don't. And because we associate CPR with living, and we associate a do not resuscitate with dying, right? And the
Right.
key and the ultimate thing is, we don't want our loved ones to die. But if you have a faith of any kind, and even if you're an atheist, the ultimate goal is death, right? We live to die.
That's right.
And so we have to begin thinking about those things. And nobody wants to lose a loved one, no matter the circumstance, whether it's a car accident, whether it's a terminal illness, whether it's a stroke or a heart attack. But these are some things that we do have to really consider and think about. And to whose glory, to whose satisfaction, other than the person who's making the decision. But what about the dying?
Right.
What does the person who's dying, what do they want? Don't their wishes matter?
I've said this on the podcast. I've been volunteering for a little bit. I haven't seen nearly as much as you. But in my experience, I've noticed that it's the people around the person dying that do the suffering for the most part.
Mhm.
Because they're at some point, the dying accept that they're dying, and at that point it's just about comfort, right?
It is. It really is about comfort. And then we have our own emotions. So everybody grieves differently, and everybody goes through the process differently. And what happens is that when we fail to respect where someone else is, then we really fail to respect the dying. So, for example, if you have a father with 5 children, it's one father, but 5 different relationships, right? Or a
Right.
mother or a grandmother, it doesn't matter. They're the same one person, but that person has a different relationship with everybody around them. So everybody will grieve differently. So I might be the kind that's laughing and joking because I'm at peace with what's happening. My brother could be crying and tearful. My sister can just be out of control with anxiety. And then the other 2 could be whatever. And so now everybody's looking at me because I'm laughing, and they're trying to figure out, well, why are you laughing? Because he's dying. And I could be looking at my brother like, why are you crying? And so what happens is there are differences, but we don't understand why we're not doing it the same way.
What a
And
dynamic.
and so we have to remember that we're all different. We're individuals. And so we deal with it differently. And maybe my laughter and my joking is just how I'm coping. Maybe laughter is my coping mechanism. And when we don't have the right people around us to help coach us through this trying moment, it can really cause heightened frustrations among the family and tension. And this is really the time that everybody needs to come together in harmony, in peace, and in love.
So this is where you come in, right? So not only do you work with the actual dying, but you work with the family around the dying.
That is correct. Yes.
And so you
So
can coach them. You can tell them, look, you guys all have different relationships. You can explain that to them and kind of break it down.
absolutely. Help coach them, help them identify where they are, help them find assurance and affirmation about where they are in the process. Why they cope the way they do, or better yet, how can we get other coping mechanisms and other coping strategies so that we can all be on one accord. There's nothing worse than having someone who's dying who wants the family to come together and the family just keeps tearing each other apart, because dying is not easy. If it's not easy for us as the living, imagine what it's like for the one who's actually going through the process.
Yeah.
You know,
And I've also heard of cases where it's not happening properly because the family is disturbing their process.
correct. And sometimes the patient needs peace. Think about if you've ever really had a really bad cold, and I hate to say this now, but the flu, right?
Right.
You really don't want to be bothered. Give me my toast, give me my tea, hand me the remote, get out.
Yeah.
Right? It's heightened, and you really just want peace, you want calm, you want quiet. So it's heightened when someone is dying. They don't want you arguing. They don't want you sitting, waiting, watching them die.
Right.
So this is also a spiritual journey for him or her.
It's private. It's private.
It is. And sometimes they just need that permission to go, but they want to make sure that the family is good. And oftentimes I hear, well, they know that. I tell, my families, tell them that you'll be okay. Tell them that mom, you're going to look after mom. And they're like, well, he knows that already. But if you think about your day-to-day communications with your family, with your mom, your grandmom, your dad, your sisters, your brothers, your children, when you're on the phone, you say, I love you. Why? It's the affirmation of what they already know. And sometimes they just need that affirmation, but it is a very spiritual journey. And it should be full of love and comfort, and peace, because especially if you have a faith, depending on what your faith is, it's their journey and they have the right to journey it. We don't have the right to take that from them. We don't have the right to cause them more anguish than what they're already going through, because we don't know what their internal turmoil might be. Or
some might be at peace and some might be scared out of their mind.
Absolutely. And so it's just important that we come together. And sometimes what happens is our loved ones come back for us. Now, some choose to believe and some don't, but that's okay. I've seen it across the board. I've seen it with Buddhists. I've seen it with atheists. I've seen it with all faiths, that they end up having an encounter with someone that has already gone on to provide them comfort and support about their journey, because it's just that it's their journey and they have the right to journey the way they so choose.
So you're saying some sort of spirit or entity may enter the room and speak with the dying? Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I'm not talking about ghosts and goblins or anything like that. I'm not a medium. I'm not a mystic. However, you will hear, I have heard patients talk about Uncle Joe, where did Uncle Joe go? And Uncle Joe died like 10 years ago. But one case in point, if I can, I had a patient who was fairly young. She was in her 50s. This was probably about 10 years ago. She had been married for about 26 years at that time. Her husband's father died when he was only 3. So he didn't know his dad. He had no pictures of his dad in the home. And she kept seeing this man. So he would go through the house and he was like, there's no man here. He thought she was crazy. And he told me she was crazy. So after talking with her, I asked her to describe the man. When she described him, he was in awe because it was his father. And it was a picture that he had when he was a teenager of his father. And she had never seen it because he no longer had it.
Hmm.
So, I like to tell people that story because we never knew. And she never met his father, of course, because he died when her husband was only 3.
Right.
So, they do exist. They do come to help usher us into our next existence. And just to let her know why he came for her, I have no idea.
Well,
But just,
I've heard stories like that before when a shocking death happens, like a car accident,
mm-hmm,
and there's no time to process the death process. It's just you're boom dead, and
right,
then uh, some sort of spirit has to come and
right,
be a guide.
mm-hmm,
And every now and again, the person gets revived, and then they can share that story. So
right.
it's a it's life's a mystery.
It is. And dying is even a greater mystery. We
Yeah,
live to die.
yeah.
But dying is not easy, and it's not easy to let anybody go. I did write a book, Death and Dying, What Does It Look Like, to help
Mm.
people who have someone that might be on hospice or has a terminal illness, what to expect. Because what I found in all of my years doing this is that when people have an understanding of what they're seeing and have an understanding of what to expect, it makes it easier. Doesn't make it easy, but it makes it easier to accept, to deal with, and go through the process and go through the journey.
And that's exactly why we're doing this recording right now.
Right.
Let's talk about fear.
Mm-hmm.
How much fear have you seen in some of these people? And what do you do? What do we do to help them not be scared?
So fear, I've seen a lot of fear, and it just depends on what the fear is. Is some of them, most people are afraid of dying, but they are afraid of the process. Most people are afraid of either one, being in pain, two, gasping for air, like especially if you have COPD, because that's a real
My dad
hard
has it. Yeah.
to take in, right?
Yep.
um, Usually the process, and it just depends on where they are, whether or not they have hospice or what kind of medicines that they're on, just reassuring them of comfort meds. If the person isn't yet on comfort meds, then I kind of encourage the family to go that route so that the patient can be comfortable.
Hmm.
Fear of leaving their loved ones behind, fear of not knowing what's going to happen to the wife. Like, is the wife going to be able to keep the house, or are the kids going to do right by the wife, or those kinds of things? What's going to happen to those that have disabled children or children with other challenges in life, and how are they going to be cared for, especially if they were in a home? Who's going to look after them? So it really just depends on the family. And so depending on the fear depends on how I'm able to coach them through the process to give them comfort and peace.
Would you say that the COPD people, the emphysema type people, the ones that are going to be gasping for air, is that the worst way, or is it all equal?
It depends, and that's really not something that I can answer. But even for those who have COPD or emphysema, if they have the right comfort measures in place, I know people don't like to talk about morphine. They get real googly eyed with that, but morphine really is not a killer drug, so to speak, as people think it is.
Right.
It really does help to provide comfort and ease of breath. Um, it it just depends. Most of the time, again, if they have the right comfort measures in place, even COPD, most of them have a very peaceable dying experience.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, so are there ever any patients that decline drugs and they're like, no, I want to go
Yes,
natural?
Absolutely. And it depends on the patient and their comfort. Some are just absolutely against it, but that's their right. And it makes it harder for the family because the patient suffers. You see the patient in pain, when you're trying to perform personal care on the patient, or when you're trying to sit the patient up, or when you're maybe trying to feed the patient if the patient is still able to eat or drink, because he or she is in pain, and that hurts you, and it gives the living, those that are caring for him, a sense of helplessness.
Mm.
And even with that, it's just comfort in knowing that they're honoring the wishes of their loved one. If they don't want the medicine, they have every right to decline.
Let's talk about age. If someone's 80 years old, they've lived a so-called full life, right? They're like,
Mhm.
I would have to think that an 80-year-old person is more accepting. But then
Yes
what
and
about,
no.
yeah, there's some,
Yes and no. It
okay.
really, and so even with that, Dr. Reese, it depends on the patient's life. Most people
Mm,
who are 80 will say, I lived a good life. I'm ready. But depending on how healthy they are or how active they were, can impact that, and they might not be ready yet. If you have an 80-year-old that's still like a 50-year-old, in mind and body, they're just not ready. But for the most part, yes, they are more accepting, they're ready. And believe it or not, most people know that it's happening, even when we don't want to talk about the D word. We don't want to talk about dying. But most people know. It's just like right before you catch a cold, before you start sneezing, before you start coughing, you know that you're about to get a cold.
right,
And
right.
it's the same thing in dying, believe it or not, that just because we don't want to talk about it doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
Yeah,
And so,
it's taboo.
yeah, yeah.
So most 80-year-olds or older are a little more accepting.
Correct.
But then you have, let's say, a 30-year-old who
Yeah.
got cancer or was in a very bad car accident.
hmm
I would have to guess, and you confirm or not, that these poor people are very unaccepting.
That is true, and it is harder, and they fight the most, and they fight the hardest, trying to do it. So even to go back to your question about no meds, we recently had a patient who was 46,
Mm,
no children. Her husband was a few years her senior, but she fought, didn't she would not take medicine until it was absolutely, she struggled as she was dying, and we had to finally medicate her. But it happens, they're young, they've got kids. What's going to happen to my kids? But not even that, but the parents, we have younger grandparents now, and so someone who is 30 or 40 might have grandkids, and so the heartbreak of not being able to see your grandchildren grow up, is devastating. It can be devastating, but again, that's where I come into play, and I come in to help provide that comfort and the assurity of life.
mm.
Helping them, mm, facilitate their faith beliefs as they are going in their life journey, um, to so that they can find a sense of peace no matter how long it takes.
I used to go to a barber shop, and the owner was a young lady, and everything seemed fine. And then one day I came in and she wasn't there. And I was like, oh, where's so and so? And the other barber is like, oh, she's dead. I'm like, huh?
Wow.
Yeah, 34 years old, brain
Mhm.
cancer, 3 kids and a husband. She went fast, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes it just, so I can't imagine what this woman went through on her deathbed at 34 years old with 3 kids and a business,
Mhm.
right? With employees.
Right. Yeah, and it's hard. And when they are young, and when you have young caregivers or young family members around the same age, it really makes you, it can rock you because it makes you think of your own mortality,
Yes.
and it makes you want to embrace how you live, right? And living like you can, because tomorrow is not promised to any of us.
No.
And one of the things that I have told some of my clients is we have a false sense of time because we think that we should live until we're 80 or 90, right?
Yep.
That's really a false expectation because that's not a guaranteed time frame for any of us.
Nope.
And like yourself, for the 34-year-old, she's 34. And we're thinking, wow, she's had her own business. She still has so much life to live. And yeah, on one hand, she did, but on the other hand, she lived her full life. And so we lose
That
track of
was her
that
time.
also.
That was her. That
And
was that was her earth sentence, if you will.
yes, absolutely. So, and it is hard though, when you think about, well, I have kids that age, what would they do? And we really have to get into a state of preparedness for that and begin talking about
Yeah.
end of life decisions, and not wait until something happens, not wait until someone gets sick, not wait until someone is in the hospital with something before we start making those decisions, because then our judgment is a little bit more clouded,
Mm,
and we really don't want to think about it, but we should.
mm.
And it helps to lessen the anxiety that we have about dying.
The 34-year-old will never see her children graduate high school, you know.
Correct.
But the lesson of it, the test, if you will, is that now it's almost a device for the husband to become
Hmm.
stronger and more connected, and for the children to become stronger and more connected. And it's going to greatly affect those three kids in that man's life forever. And so there's it's like a device, a lesson to 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 enhance.
Hmm. Absolutely. And learning how to cope. And so with those children, it's going to be cyclical grief. They're going to wish their mom was there for middle school graduation, high school graduation, college graduation, first boyfriend, first girlfriend, first heartbreak, right? Wedding, any major events, they're always going to wish mom was there. But yes, it should unify them. But again, this is also where faith comes into play, because our faith should allow us the comfort and the peace of mind to be able to get through. What a lot of people try to do is say, get over it. You will never, ever get over the death of someone who impacted your life, but you can get through it,
Mm,
right? It's just like a tunnel. If I'm driving my car, I can't go over the Holland Tunnel, but I can get through it. And as I'm going through, it's going to be congested, it's going to be dark, but I know that on the other side, there is light. And
mm.
even in our grieving process, we have to remember that there is light, and life is still worth living. There is still a lot of life to live, a lot of things to do, and a lot of things to accomplish. I think that when we go from, the dying aspect, and we enter into the grieving, the full grieving aspect, we put a timetable on it. There is no timetable, right? Because everybody grieves differently and in different amounts of time. But if we rely on our faith will help get us through, regardless of beliefs.
Right. Do you see a difference between a faith-based person, like say Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, versus the atheist? Do you see a difference?
Yes. Usually the atheists are a little harder in their demeanor when it comes to death and acceptance. And I think a lot of that is because for some of them, they just think, oh, well, there's nothing there, so it's no big deal. Some of them who it's hard to stomach the fact that you'll never see their loved one again, but because you don't believe. So I actually have a family that I'm working with now. She is atheist. My client is atheist. Her husband is Catholic.
Hmm.
And so she doesn't think that she will ever see her husband again. And for her husband, that's kind of harsh because that's not what he believes. So it's really a matter of
Hmm.
trying to get her, really not trying to get her to meet any other need than her own, but she's okay with it. She's okay with dying, but her husband is not because he fears that he will not see her again. So the faith does play a factor in how someone passes away and how someone gets through their grieving process.
Hmm. How has this profession, this job that you do, how has it affected your life as Nichol the person?
It really hasn't, believe it or not. I believe that this was a calling, that I was called to do what I do
Hmm.
because I have the gift of help. I have the gift of helping people get through dark moments and times in their lives. And that for me is the ultimate satisfaction. I have the ability to cut off. I'm in the moment with my patients. I think the only time that it really impacts me is if there is someone I know that is terminally ill or not doing well and nobody wants to talk about it. My husband tells me that, you can't always be so direct with everybody else because they don't understand.
Hmm.
But it's what I do, naturally. And that's how it really affects me is, when I'm trying to help friends or if people call me and say, hey, I have somebody, my mom or this kind of thing. That's when it impacts me the most, is when people don't want to take the necessary measures to do what needs to be done, one for their own mental health and two for the comfort and assurance of their loved one. That's when it impacts me, but other than that, it really doesn't.
In order for you to do this, you have to have a heck of a bedside manner, correct? I mean,
Yes, absolutely.
are you a nurturer by nature?
I am i am a nurturer by nature, but I also believe in meeting people where they are. So I have learned how to meet people where they are with no expectation of them being anything other than. And I believe that's what makes me so exceptionally good at what I do,
Hmm.
and being able to help people understand the dying process. Because once they can understand the dying process, then they can also begin to understand the grieving process because they're not one and the same.
Right, right. It makes sense.
Yeah.
So you have to deal with different faiths. So you might have a patient that's Buddhist.
Hmm.
You might have a patient that's Catholic. You might have a patient that's Taoist. There's not many Taoists around here, but
Hmm.
what types of different rituals have you seen or
So
processes?
So believe it or not, I've seen the incense, I've seen the shrouds, I've seen the tarot cards, I've seen it all.
Hmm.
So it's, for me, it's not about what I believe, right? Because what I believe isn't going to get them where they need to go. And
Hmm.
so what's important is being able to recognize and understand what they need for their next life journey to come to pass,
It,
and
it
just being able to be in the moment.
it's so refreshing to hear that.
Yeah, because a lot of people can't do that. A lot of people aren't able to cut off. what
Mm-mm.
they feel or what they believe to be their own personal convictions.
That's
But
right.
my personal convictions are not your convictions.
That's
So
right. That's right.
wherever you are and wherever you need to be, my role as an end of life coach is to get you there. It's not about me getting you where I think you should be. It's about getting you where you want to be. And if I'm able to do that, then I have done my job well.
Well said. How many people dying have you come across that are happy? Like they're like, this is great. I can't wait for this to happen.
I'd probably say about a handful.
Hmm.
Some people are. Some people are really in tune with their faith. They know where they're going. They have no fears of it, and they embrace it. So, but yeah, a lot of them, that this is what they've lived for. They've lived to die so they can live again.
And that's how I feel. And the other thing is a lot of people are scared to die because they haven't accomplished what they wanted to accomplish. And so they feel
Hmm.
like they're not finished. I can't die now. I got more
Hmm.
things to do.
Right. And that happens too. And so, depending on where they are in the process, I help them with it. If it's a book, I'll help them finish their book. If it's painting or writing, I'll help them paint or write or have somebody paint or write. I had one client who was a painter, and she just had like a studio full of pictures that she wanted to donate, but she hadn't gotten around to identifying them. So I asked her, showed her her pictures. Who is this going to? And wrote the name on it. And what I couldn't do, I had her family chip in. I had another patient who was writing a book. She was an older patient. She was in her 80s. She was a teacher. She had written two books about 30 years ago, but never got them published.
Hmm.
And then she was writing her life journey, a memoir,
Hmm.
and so helped her write that and was able to get the first two books to a publisher so that they could be published. She didn't want to sell them, but she wanted them for the family to have. So able to get it to a publisher to publish it. And then the third book was able to put it together for her and then give to her family for her family to do with what they wanted to. They weren't sure if they wanted to have it published or what they were doing because it was so personal and so intimate, because it was as she was going through her life journey process. So it's just depending on where they are. If with that unfinished business, if I can help, I'll help. Otherwise, if they need to, if somebody else needs to do it, I kind of encourage them to get it, whether it's a lawyer or, a realtor or whoever it is, so that they can feel a sense of accomplishment and not having such a loss of control.
Yes, I mean that is so cool that
Hmm.
you did that with her. And did she live long enough to see it get at least
She
published to the
did.
family?
She saw the two books. Yes, the two books got published while she was still living, and it was the third book because, of course, it was her memoir. So she was actually writing up until 3 days before she died.
Wow. And
So
she
yes,
she and she probably had such satisfaction from that.
absolutely. It's what made living worth living, or her dying worth dying for. Hmm.
Do you ever ask a client that's dying, hey, is there anything you ever wanted to do that I can help you with right now?
Yes, always,
Yeah.
because I never know, if there's any unfinished business that needs to be taken care of. So always, that's important. That's a vital part of their journey too, and them feeling fulfilled that they can let go, and that's important.
If you don't let go, you get dragged.
Correct. And sometimes you just drag on, and the goal is to die peaceably without that emotional baggage.
I think the key word is contentment.
Yes.
To feel content. And I talk about that
Yes.
a lot on this podcast. And, using myself as an example, I feel so content. Like I'm 40. I've pretty much done everything I wanted to do. So everything's bonus at this point. And uh, I feel very satisfied.
Oh, wonderful. Amen.
So, everything I do now is like bonus, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Absolutely.
And I don't know if
But
many people can say that. And I just urge people to just don't put things off. Just if you have something, I don't like to use the word dream, but if you
right.
have an intention to do something, if you always wanted to do something, then do it.
Yeah, and I encourage people the same. If you want to travel, travel. Don't wait until you retire, because when you retire, you might not be able to travel.
Right.
If there's something that you want to do, do it. If you want to go parasailing, if you want to go snorkeling or skydiving, do it. Make time to do it, because again, tomorrow is not promised to any of us. And dying should actually be a beautiful experience. And I know people
Yes.
say, how can you say that? Because dying is just like living, right? When we come into this world, it is a beautiful experience. When a woman gives birth, it is a hard experience on a woman, right? The
Yeah.
overall experience is hard. It's hard on the baby, and the baby comes out all junky, but it's a beautiful experience, with
Mm.
the pain and everything. And dying should also be a beautiful experience. It should be
Yes.
an experience that we don't cringe or turn away from, but one that we really embrace, because it could be as good and as it can be. And I understand that for some of us it's very traumatic, in how we go, but the a good death experience, also helps us with our coping mechanisms as well.
Right. Like you said, if we're prepared for this, when that moment happens, even if it's a bad accident of some sort, the experience will be better.
Right. And we do. And we have to start talking about that. We don't. Do you want to be buried or do you want to be cremated? I don't know
Mm.
why that's a hard topic for people, but it is. Who do you want to use? Are you a military vet? Do you want to have military honors? Do you want to be buried in a military cemetery, wherever you are, or the veteran cemetery, excuse me? You know, um, what do you want to wear? And for some people, they find that it's morbid, but it isn't. What happens is we wait until it happens, and then we're running around trying to get everything in place. And at that point, that's the time that you should really be grieving with your family, so you lose 2 or 3 days because you didn't make the plans. When I travel, if I want to go to California, I'm going to plan my trip to California. I'm going to plan the hotel. I'm going to plan what airline I'm going on. I'm going to plan what I'm going to do when I'm there. If I go to the Caribbean, the same thing. So why aren't we planning for the end of life so that it's less stressful?
That's
So
right.
because I don't wait until the day I'm leaving to say, oh, well, I'm going to go fly United today, or I'll wait till I get to California to find a hotel. We don't do that, right?
Yeah.
Because it's added stress. So even before we get sick, what about life insurance? Do you have life insurance
Mm.
outside of your job? Because if you lose your job, then you lose your life insurance. And then what?
Right. Right.
So these are all conversations that I have with my clients to get them to the place where they need to be. And all of my clients aren't old, they're young. I have clients who are 40 and 50, and it's really just a matter of helping them get their life affairs in order so that when the life journey begins, they're ready and they're prepared.
Mm.
My mother, my grandmother, I did it with. My in-laws, I've done it with. My brother-in-law, my sister-in-law, especially if you have an illness, you know, MS, cerebral palsy, if you have a disability of any kind, you should already be forward thinking about what do you want to have happen should anything happen, because it helps the family. Because then if I know that you want to be cremated, but somebody else wants you to be buried, I could say, I'm honoring so-and-so's wishes because this is what they wanted. Especially with blended families. It's very important because I can want one thing, and if I had a stepfather, my stepfather might want something else for my mom. And now
Right.
we're at a conflict.
Mm.
So it's very important that even as we're talking about death and dying, that we really talk about what are we doing while we're living. Diabetes is a big one now, and it's running rampant, young and old.
Mm.
So we really do have to begin preparing. And what is it? Your life insurance policy at one point was just to cover the burial. Well, a burial is going to cost you anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000. And that's a generic burial, right? But what if you're young? Like you said, the 34-year-old woman,
Mm-hmm.
she's young with the business, kids, I'm sure a house. So now you go from a 2-person household to a 1-person household. Her life insurance should have been able to cover the household for at least 6 months to a year, so that the husband can kind of stay on his feet and stay ahead of the game and not fall behind. Those are the kinds of things that I discuss with my clients and helping them with their life choices.
Mm. One of the interesting dynamics of dying has a lot to do with ego and sort of clinging to the material world. And one of the things I bring up on this podcast a lot, and it might sound depressing to some people, but yeah, when you die, your family's going to be affected, but eventually they're going to die. The next generation's going to die. And then the generation after that is going to die. And we all die.
Right.
But who the heck is going to remember us in 300 years?
I think we all want a legacy, but I think our legacy is right now. I think that what's happening is it's not for the person that's dying, but for those that are left behind, because we don't want you to go, right? Like you said, I don't want you to go for my own selfish reasons, right? It could be whatever the reason is. But I think we all want a legacy, right? Like I want a legacy for my children. I want my children to remember, who their mom was, and I would hope that they would pass down to my grandchildren, and then my grandchildren would pass down. I don't think that really impacts the one that is dying, though, because you do all that while you're living. So it goes back to what you said earlier, live. If there's something you want to do it, right? Don't wait about it. But for us that are living, to not be selfish and give our loved one the opportunity to die in peace with dignity and love.
Mm. What advice would you give to someone that's in a position where they have a loved one dying right now? What would be your advice?
My advice would be talk often, kiss, hold hands. It just depends on where they are and what's happening. Did the person just find out about it? But that really is my main advice, is be the family that you've always been. Continue doing what you can do until you can't do it any longer.
Something just popped in my head. What have you ever seen a situation where the person dying didn't have the best relationship with, say, a brother, sister, or a kid, but the death brought them together?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, so that's part of the reconciliatory work also, because that also helps them die peacefully, and being able to say the I'm sorry's and the I love you's, right? Being at peace, that helps them to be at peace.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, I hope listeners got a lot out of this. I know death is a taboo subject.
Correct.
But
it is, and it really shouldn't be.
No, we got to talk about it, and so I'm very satisfied by this conversation. And hey, listen, get ready to die, all of us. Let's go.
That's right.
It's just a vacation to me, man. Let's go.
Yeah, listen, if you're a Christian, then you already know that you're heaven bound. The scripture tells us to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So as soon as your heart stops, you are in the twinkling of an eye already in heaven's gates. Christ tells us that, right? And if you're Catholic, then you also know that you are heaven bound. If you're Jewish, you know that eventually you're going to be heaven bound. That is where you will be in the second coming. So wherever it is, that's whatever your faith is, you have to trust in your faith as you're dying and lean on it to know that your glory will come. It just, how or when just depends on what you believe.
Right. And if you're
But
Buddhist,
death should be beautiful.
if you're Buddhist, then you're coming back and
Absolutely.
you're going through school again.
Absolutely. So yeah, so whatever that is, you know, I had somebody tell me she wanted to come back as a cherry blossom tree, and I was like, all right, I'm good with it. I like cherries.
All right. That's great.
You know, so yeah, so get ready. Absolutely.
So where can the listeners find your book, and where can they come say hello to you?
Oh, you can find my website is www.drnicholeburris. It's DRNICHOLBURRIS.com. You can purchase my books from there. I'm on Amazon as well. You can reach me on Facebook, Dr. Nichol Burris, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All again, Dr. Nichol Burris.
All right, there it is. Dr. Nichol Burris, I appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Reese. I appreciate you ever so much. You have a great day on purpose.
And what a lead in. On the next episode, 48, I'm talking to John Scott, who had a near-death experience and supposedly met God. You don't want to miss that one. If you're looking for my work, go to drreese.com. That's doctor spelt out. And I'll talk to you on the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Inner Peace with Dr. Reese. If this episode opened your heart, feel free to share on social media and tell your loved ones. Also, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, may peace be with you.